get him, and then Khan fills with a rucksack. And so it's totally different. It's standing up rather than sitting down. So it gives two totally different accounts. And then at the inquest, he comes back to his original account of Khan sitting down, and he says Khan looked just like any ordinary commuter. You wouldn't recognise he was different. Well, that couldn't be him at all, because, you know, there's no accounts, even though a baseball cap, and there's no accounts of him looking like an ordinary commuter. There's also, so there's various testimonies that give two huge holes. People graphically describe how they're clambering around these two frightening huge holes by the second set of double doors. Okay? Then there's also some quite important testimony by the driver of the train. Now, the driver of the train isn't in shock like everyone else is, Ray Whitehurst. And this inquest is the very first time he's allowed to speak. Right? We never heard, before that, we never knew who the train driver was. And he describes how his first experience of the blast was being lifted up in the driver's coach. He was lifted up, and then suddenly his train stopped and he slammed against the front of his coach, his cabin. So it stopped very abruptly after being lifted up. And he then gets out, he walks back, he's walking back through the first carriage, and he wants to go through the door between the first and second coach, and somebody's lying across there, and he can't go through that door because he sees on the other side a huge gaping hole in the floor, and he knows he'd fall through it if he did. So he gets out of the carriage and walks around and comes back. Now that's his testimony. And that big hole which he sees is nowhere near the other two. The other two are right down by the second set of double doors. And this one is right up by the very front of the coach. So you've got three huge holes, and get this, all three of them have somebody fall into them. And the inquest has graphic and terrible accounts. Somebody up, the hole we just looked at, that Ray Whitehurst sees, someone sitting there, and you're given their position of where they're sitting, and they describe how they fall into it, and they think they're going to die, and then they're rescued, somebody pulls them out. And likewise, with another one with those two huge holes in the Israel Road blast, one of them, somebody in there who does die, can't get out, and all his lower limbs are somehow mangled up, and so he dies stuck in that hole. And a third person falls into one of these holes and is then got out. My article about this actually got posted up on the David Icke news headlines, and I think that is totally conclusive evidence that there was not a single rucksack. There's absolutely no way a single rucksack could have produced those three different holes in the Edgware Road coach, quite apart from lifting it up off the rails. Okay, so I think the people of London should focus their minds on the evidence as it's now appeared in the inquest, and just wake up a bit. Okay, if I may just perhaps remind you, this inquest, what was it about? What's the point of it? It was a 5-month affair, 5 months, right? Hundreds of millions of pounds spent, and there was at no point was there any intelligent mind evaluating what was happening. Normally in a British justice system, you have an adversarial system, you know, of two people who are trained to be sceptical and grill and cross-examine. At this inquest, all we had was a smarmy lawyer, Hugo Keith, which, you know, presenting the government view and making sure it all went efficiently. And Lady Justice Hallett, who was there to reassure everyone, to thank everybody, to make sure no one was offended, and so forth. So there was nowhere, at no stage was there any mind evaluating it. And I'd like to ask you, can you remember any newspaper report you read of it in which the journalists had anything at all to think about? Was there any exercise of thought by British journalists throughout this whole inquest? I mean, they were told who was guilty, and they just put out what they were told to, didn't they? So I think we need to focus a bit. The only ray of hope, let me just say this, at the end of the inquest, they had a last day in which they supposedly debunked conspiracy theories, and then the Independent had a report just saying, you know, inquest ends, and they allowed discussion. Normally the British people are not allowed to comment or discuss this at all. Like the BBC didn't allow any questions or anything, and that was the only discussion that was allowed by the British people. And of the 22 comments, 20 were totally sceptical of the inquest government's view, you know. So I thought that was an encouraging sign.
We've got 2 minutes, and then we really have to.
Right. Okay.